Well, welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I am Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, you can get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. For those of you listening on the audio podcast, right there is just, I'm pointing to my email. That's all I'm doing. So send me an email, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Today, we're going to have a really cool conversation with a guest that I had years ago, actually, in another podcast. His name is Larry Swanson. He's a full stack content architect, and we're going to find out exactly what that means. He also has a cool podcast, which he's going to tell us about, all about content strategy. But today, the topic of conversation is about migrating from a legacy CMS to a headless CMS. It really isn't a question anymore, is should we? Is we will. We have to, because of the way things are going. We have too many delivery channels, too much content out there, and we got to do that. Now, the question is, how do you do that? What are things you need to know before you do that? Now, if you're in the progress of doing that, this episode is still going to be helpful to you, because we're going to have a lot of tips and ideas to talk through with Larry. But as always, for those of you that don't have an account with headlesscreator.com, go ahead and get one. For those of you on audio, just go to headlesscreator.com, register to a free account. For those of you watching on video right now, you see the website right now on the screen. Once you register and you get your free account at headlesscreator.com, you're going to have access not only to all the episodes of this podcast, but all the tutorials in the Discover Headless Tech course as well, plus all of my other courses, which include as you can see right here, includes focus on courses on a variety of headless CMSs, my content modeling course as well, in a variety of, here's the Content Modeling Weekly, where I model stuff all the time. All of you know I'm a huge content modeling geek. I love content modeling. So anyway, I know I'm speeding through this because I want to get to Larry real quick, because he's a great guy to talk to. So that's it. Remember to get your account at headlesscreator.com, and the on-demand version will be available there probably an hour after we're done having the conversation with Larry. So with that said, I'm just going to bring him in. Larry, welcome.
Hey, Marcelo. It's always great to see you.
Great to see you too. So we're going to start by giving those watching a little warning that you're having a couple of issues with your internet over there. So sometimes Larry's turning into Max Headroom. Those of you remembering the 80s, if you got the stuttering Larry, you know what I'm talking about.
Not quite that old. Well, yeah.
Well, come on. I'm not that old either, but I still.
No, I do remember Max Headroom.
I do remember Max Headroom in the 80s, but you do freeze once in a while that you're having some internet. But the lucky part is all your audio is good. So I just want to give people a heads up on that's what's happening. Having said that, welcome, sir.
Great to be here. Always fun to talk with you, Marcelo.
Definitely. Same here. So, you invited me on your podcast, and it's real quick. You have a podcast called...
It's called Content Strategy Insights, and I started it almost 4 years ago now. And I can talk a little bit about that. It was part of my transition from identifying as a publisher to identifying as a content strategist. That's something that had been in the works for a long time. I just kind of formalized it and then kind of codified it with the podcast.
Yeah, and the nice thing about you is not only you're a strategist, but you're also a content creator. So obviously, with the hands-on experience that you have, you're really good at that strategy. You understand what content creators go through. So
yeah, I've definitely been all the way up and down, and through the creation, the management, the whole stack.
Yep, definitely. So speaking of stack, you call yourself a full stack content architect. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, so it goes back. The stack comes from, if you know Jesse James Garrett, he was one of the pioneers of the field of user experience design. He created this brilliant model years ago, more than 20 years ago now, I think, where he articulated the practice of user experience design as having these 5 layers. The foundational layer is strategy, and the next, which is like that sort of aligning business intent and customer needs and figuring out what to do and planning for your content. And so I link content strategy to the strategy layer in Jesse James Garrett's model. His next level up is called scope, which is concerned with sort of the it used to be like specking out what you were going to do, the which exact content, which exact features, what you wanted to do with your digital application. I liken that to content modeling, where you sort of set the scope that you want to cover in your content initiative, whatever scale it is. And then sort of, and I think the really important thing there is part of that scope is the meaning and we'll talk more about this later, I'm sure, about what Jeff Eaton would call the title case content modeling, aligning people around language and stuff like that. So it's sort of real fundamental work, kind of a level up from strategy, but not quite up to the next level, which is information architecture, which is, I think, what a lot of folks in this world are going to be concerned with, is sort of the actual structure of the content. That's where you figure out, how you'll componentize or structure or your content, and how you'll organize it, label it, for easy retrieval later on. That corresponds to what Jesse James Garrett calls the structure layer. The next level up from that is what he calls the skeleton, and that really aligns with part of what, depending on how you define it, we can talk about all the problems with labeling content activities. That's a whole other conversation. But that's the level at which you sort of assemble things in like app and other digital product design. That level of the skeleton level is concerned with with kind of interaction design and kind of putting things together to get them ready for presentation, which takes us up to the next level, which is the surface layer, which is like the user interface, the design of the pages, and in terms of the content world, it's that level would correspond with this new practice of UX writing. It's not really a new practice. We've been writing user interface copy and onboarding copy and all that stuff for decades, but it's recently been kind of codified as this field of UX writing. So when I say full stack, I either call myself a full stack content designer or I think of a content architect as like that I'm comfortable at any place in those layers. I focus on the foundational layers now, which is, I think, why you had me on the podcast, on your show.
Well, I had you on the podcast because I like you, but beyond that, of course. But I think your breakdown is great, because when you're migrating from a legacy to a headless CMS, you need to have those clear breaks and understand and how to work through each of those layers. Because with a legacy CMS, everything, it was jumbled up, right? Everything was mixed up together. There was no separation like that. And we're going to get into all of that. So why don't we start out with some examples of a legacy CMS so people understand what we're talking about. Give us some examples of what are some legacy CMSs.
Well, that's a long list, and there's a whole bunch of
Let's narrow it down to maybe 3.
Yeah. Well, no, and let me talk about it a little bit, because each of these categories I think has slightly, but anyhow, I divided, there's sort of like, for like small businesses, restaurants, and independent consultants and people like that, there's the page builder categories, things like Wix and Squarespace, and I would put WordPress.com, the hosted version of WordPress, in that category. Then there's sort of like the big world of open source, Drupal and the WordPress.org installations, and Joomla is still around, and open source systems like that. Then there's proprietary systems. Many of those are like kind of no code, low code, like content, Webflow is in that category. Then there's like the enterprise systems like Adobe Experience Manager, Sitecore, the big heavy duty applications. Then there's more focused ones like product CMSs. Like some people might not call it this, but products like Shopify or Magento or WooCommerce there's a lot of content associated with those product management systems. And then the Marcom stack, there's this gazillions of things, like everything from like gather content to HubSpot stuff. So there's a whole bunch of dedicated, these are applications that are dedicated to serving a particular niche or audience, and they're sort of like what you were saying, they're the kind of the big monolithic systems where they do all of the content stuff, and we can talk about how that breaks down, like what all they do and how that changes in a headless world. I guess that's what we're talking about for
completely. Yeah. And I'm glad you said page centric, because most of them are page centric. In other words, their focus is the web. Right. But today we have more than the web. and we're going to get into omni-channel delivery, multi-channel delivery in just a second. But okay, so those are some examples of legacy, right, quote unquote, CMSs. What are some examples of headless CMSs? You kind of mentioned by mistake in the legacy Contentful, right? So
Exactly.
Contentful is one of the big ones. What else do we have out there that people
Yeah,
should
there's
be
well,
aware of?
yeah, again, there's sort of categories there, that I would say of headless. One category would be a lot of those old legacy systems are decoupling and
Hmm.
teasing out the content management part. Like Drupal's really good at that. I know Sitecore, like all of them are doing
I think
something. So
WordPress is
that
trying to do that too.
Exactly, yeah, and they had the RESTful API years ago, and they're doing more. Anyhow, everybody's kind of coming along that way to decoupling. They get what you said earlier, that this is the future. This is just how we're going to be doing it. So that's the first thing you'll see is the old legacy systems kind of trying to pull out the CMS as a separate thing. The simplest CMS is like a bunch of markdown files in a folder someplace
Hmm.
that you then serve up from a static site generator. That's super common for a lot of like special technical documentation or kind of publishing applications where you're mainly concerned with pages. That system falls down pretty quickly if you want to do anything fancy,
Right.
but it's very common. And then there's sort of like open source. There's like open source platforms like Strapi and Ghost, and there's a category like that. And then there's like then there's the to what you were saying, like there's Contentful and Kentico content and all of the commercial typically, I think they're virtually all SaaS app hosted kinds of services. And then there's what I think, I don't know where to put sanity.io in that thing. They're more like a content platform. They're more like a database. They're like a content data platform. Anyhow, but a lot of people just use them as a headless CMS. So I would put them in that category as well. And then there's the whole other part of the headless, in addition to the headless CMS, like what you're working with on the front end, and maybe we'll talk about this separately, is like this whole new category of static site generators, tools like Gatsby and Jekyll and Eleventy and Next.js, all kinds of different React frameworks to assemble things on the front end. So that's sort of like all those things I just described. If you kind of mush them up in certain ways, you get one of those old legacy CMSs.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm glad you mentioned like Gatsby and Eleventy and all this, because this goes towards my next question is, what do we mean by headless, right? Explain. When I first got into this and they told me, hey, we got to bring in a headless CMS, I'm like, okay, this sounds illegal for some reason. I don't know. So obviously I know what it means now, right? But for the audience that are looking to move, what do we mean by headless? Why is that so important and critical to this whole new way of doing things?
Mhm. Yeah, so the head that you're decapitating from your content management, your big, I guess I would say there's sort of a capital C content management system, like in the true sense of a system. Like there's this new ecosystem that's emerging where but these were all embedded in one big giant application in the old legacy system. So you would have, here's the main components are your authoring component. Like how does stuff get into this data? There's a database of content at the middle of these systems. And that's where you store everything. And it's stored kind of in a nice, tidy, structured way so that you can do different stuff with it. In the old days, like in the old legacy systems, the authoring was just filling out web forms to fill specific database fields. It's kind of almost a one-to-one correspondence in many cases. That authoring experience is going to change a lot with the headless world. So there's sort of authoring over